Good morning, Bushu Anishinaabe. Hello, friends. My name is Elizabeth Kronk Warner. My pronouns are she and hers. And it is my pleasure to be here with you today for another Dean's book review. And it's a special day for many reasons. First, of course, we have an amazing group of panelists and we have a really important discussion. But also, for the first time, I get to use the University of Utah's new Tribal Land Acknowledgement Statement. As you know, I like to always start off our events by acknowledging that at least the land where I'm at today, because I am in the Salt Lake Valley, was traditionally Indigenous lands. And on October 12th, the University of Utah adopted an official, land acknowledgement statement. So I'm going to use that today for the first time. So we acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshu, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. So today is my pleasure. We're doing something a little bit different for this month's book review. For the first time, we have a movie, Crip Camp, which hopefully you had a chance to watch. If you haven't watched it already, I very much encourage you to watch it at another time when you're able to. And it follows a group of people with disabilities, many of whom were campers at this camp in upstate New York in 1971. And what happens after they leave the camp and their careers and in terms of the law and rights for people with disabilities. It was really an eye-opening movie for me. I have to say, many of the things that were said and the themes that were explored in the movie really sat with me and forced me to reevaluate what I think is my own implicit bias against people with disabilities. I think oftentimes for me, as somebody who is very interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, I will admit that I oftentimes forget about issues impacting people with disabilities. And I think that's my own personal blind spot. So I personally was very much impacted by this movie and appreciated it. And it's appropriate that we should be talking about the rights of people with disabilities, as October is Disability Awareness Month. And so it's a really good time for us to reflect perhaps on our own blindness and what we have to learn. And I think this movie is a really nice way to do it. Before I turn it over to our panelists, there were a couple of things about the movie that, again, just really sat with me. So first, the movie starts off with some home video of this camp, Camp Janelle, which was open in the early 70s and was available to people with disabilities. And it was an opportunity for people with disabilities to come together and to just be themselves. And one thing that really becomes clear at the beginning of the movie in this footage of the camp from the early 1970s is that happiness is really this connection to feeling heard. And so often we hear the people at the camp saying this was the first time being at the camp that they really felt like they were heard and they were seen as people, and not people with disabilities or handicapped people or people with limitations, but they really felt like they could just be people. And again and again and again, it comes back to this sense of them feeling heard, and also this sense of joy and happiness that comes through in these home videos or videos from the early 1970s from the camp. And so I think that really drives home that for everybody, regardless of who you are and where you are in the life, the importance of feeling heard really comes through alive and well. Another camper early on in the movie said something that just really stuck with me. He talks about the privilege of privacy and how the people with disabilities that are highlighted in the movie never have the privilege of privacy, never have that ability of being alone and being by themselves. And that really got to me as somebody who myself, I sometimes just need that alone time, even if it's just going for a walk, to be alone and to have time to process things. And so I thought that was very impactful, this idea that some people with disabilities never have that privilege, never have the ability of being alone with their thoughts. So that definitely impacted me as well. There's some video there from Geraldo Rivera, which I have to say, I thought, wow, Geraldo Rivera still looks the same as he did in the 1970s, but he did an undercover investigative report of institutions and just how horrifically people with disabilities were treated and were put in institutions in the 1970s. It really drove home that we've come a long way in 50 years, which was very impactful and unsettling to see those images and to see how people were treated. And then the last thing I'll comment on before I throw it over to our distinguished panel is the movie also talks about efforts that were made to help the community and to protect the community's rights. And one of the early efforts was Section 5, I believe it was 504, which would have required any institution that was getting federal money to not discriminate against people with disabilities, which of course would have meant things like ramps and elevators. And there's an interview with, I believe it was the head of the New York transportation system saying, this is absolutely ridiculous. We can't do this. It's too expensive. And besides, who would it really help? How many people would it help? And one was floored that somebody would be so callous in their treatment of other people, but also again just this concept of how far we've come in the last 50 years in terms of making our buildings and facilities accessible. I mean, certainly we still have a ways to go, but I thought that was a really good eye-opener of the last 50 years. So with that, we have 3 panelists today. So our first speaker is going to be Dr. Leslie Francis, who is a professor here at the Quinney College of Law and also has a joint appointment in philosophy. And so Dr. Francis, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to get my camera turned on and my slide turned on because my slide, I hope, will manage to provide accessibility through captioning. So let's see if that works. Okay, so I saw Crip Camp at Sundance. It won the Audience Award. I loved it. And I'm going to try to convey to you just a little bit of why I thought it was such an amazing movie, not only for disability rights activism, but for all of us. So what you see on the slide on the right-hand side is some of the archival footage that Dean Kronk Warner referred to of Camp Jened, which was near Woodstock, hippy-dippy-skippy in upstate New York. What you see there is the campers hanging out. You see them being kids. You see them playing sports. You see them picking each other up. You see them arguing with each other. You see them playing music together. And yes, you see them falling in love, having their first crushes, recognizing their sexuality very directly. One couple who met in Crip Camp end up getting married. There are later interviews with their child as an adult. So you see people. Then the movie goes to Berkeley, California, where many of them either went to university or went out to Berkeley. Berkeley was not only an attractive place for folks with Summer of Love and all kinds of things like that. Berkeley was also the center of the independent living movement. And that was a tremendously important place, demonstration, way for people with disabilities to show that they can live in the community, go to school, work just like anybody else. Of course, sometimes with appropriate accommodation. The directors of the movie, Nicole Newnham and Jim Lebrecht, had worked together for quite some time. Lebrecht actually was a Crip camper, ended up first at Berkeley Rep. You see scenes of him. He has spina bifida, crawling up into the upper area of the stage at Berkeley Rep. One wishes for accessibility, but look at his phenomenal success. So then the movie, the first of the major disability rights statutes that Dean Kronk Warner referred to, the Rehabilitation Act in 1973, which prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities by entities receiving federal funding. Now, when you have a statute like that, that's Section 504 that I quoted, you need implementing regulations. So the statute gets enacted in 1973. Come 1977, the implementing regs have not yet been issued. So we're now in the presidency of Jimmy Carter. Joseph Califano is the secretary of HEW. And the Berkeley, many of the folks from the Berkeley Independent Living Movement, led by Judy Heyman, who is a camper and one of the stars of the movie, still a very forceful disability rights activist today, they decided, let's go sit in at the federal building in San Francisco to get these regulations issued. For 28 days, fortified by pizza brought by, among others, Black activists in the San Francisco area. There they are, and they manage to live in the federal building for nearly a month, at which point, finally, the regulations implementing the Rehabilitation Act, which at the end of the day were the prototype for the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. And the final scene in the movie is the issuance of the signing of the ADA by President Bush. So let me say a couple of things about themes in the movie that really moved me. The first is that the underlying animus of the disability rights movement has been captured in a kind of slogan: nothing about us without us. That's the animating force of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the last of the great human rights treaties, which our country has not signed on to, but which is the law in the European Union. The CRPD formulated, developed with many people with disabilities at the center, nothing about us without us, emphasizes the critical importance of full legal personhood for persons with disabilities. So instead of taking away legal rights through mechanisms such as guardianship, the idea of the CRPD is to enable people with disability to be and function as full legal persons. Well, Crip Camp is about people with disabilities functioning as full persons showing in practice nothing about us without us, all the way to getting the government to do what it needed to do, which was issue the regulations implementing the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that's one theme from the movie, the importance of people with disabilities at the center of disability rights. Another theme that I saw in the movie is freedom. But it's not the idea of freedom from, or freedom, my freedom is that I get to not wear a mask because masks are about me. Not the kind of freedom that is, I get to do whatever I want, unless, as Robert Nozick said, I leave a knife in your chest. But an idea of freedom that recognizes our interconnections, that in order to be free ourselves, we need one another. We also need to recognize our differences. So freedom amidst difference, freedom rooted in solidarity, and freedom rooted in inclusion. Because without inclusion, none of us can really be fully who we are. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Adina Zaranikova from Utah's Disability Law Center. And I'm going to stop sharing right now so she can share.
Thank you so much, Professor Francis, for this wonderful presentation. I'm going to try to share my screen here in a second and hope to be able to start my presentation. First of all, I would like to thank you very much for having me here today. It is a great honor to be here with you, and I would like to thank Dean Kronk Warner for inviting me to join her book review today, and Dr. Smith and Professor Francis for making this conversation possible. Again, my name is Adina Zradnikova, and I'm the Executive Director of the Utah Disability Law Center, which is the protection and advocacy agency for people with disabilities in our state. As a disability advocate for over 2 decades, I'm truly grateful for having the opportunity to share a few thoughts about how we can be better allies in building a more welcoming and inclusive society for everyone, a society that we can all be proud of. I hope you are enjoying the last beautiful days of October. This is definitely my most favorite time of the year, but October is also the National Disability Employment Awareness Month, as the Dean said, a time when we all pay tribute to the accomplishments of the men and women with disabilities whose work helps keep our nation's economy strong. And this year in particular marks not only the 75th observance of the National Disability Employment Awareness Month, but also the 30th anniversary of the ADA, which gives us another reason to reflect on the progress we have made as a nation in securing equal rights and defending the inherent dignity of all Americans. So I'm gonna just take a minute and tell you a few things about my agency, the Disability Law Center. We are a private nonprofit organization designated as the protection and advocacy agency for the state. And we work to ensure that people with disabilities in our state have full access to equal employment, community living, education, housing, and voting, transportation, just to name a few of the areas we work in. And we have statutory agency, we have statutory authority to provide legal representation for all people with disabilities under all federal and state laws. And we are required by federal law to maintain a presence in facilities that care for people with disabilities. So you would often find us in nursing homes, group homes, jails and prisons, juvenile detention facilities, and classrooms, special education classrooms in camps, and wherever people with disabilities live. And we work to ensure full access to inclusive healthcare, employment, education, and housing. So just wanted to say a few things about disability. Disability, as the DD Act, the Developmental Disabilities Act, says is a natural part of the human experience. There have always been people with disabilities in the world, and there will always be. Like gender and identity, disability is simply one of the many natural characteristics of being human. Worldwide, approximately 15% of the world's population, or over 1 billion people, live with some form of disability. In the United States, 1 in 5 Americans is a person with a disability. And some are born with disabilities, others acquire disabilities through accidents, illnesses, or the aging process. And many folks who do not have disabilities will have one in the future. In fact, if you live to the age of 70, there's a great chance of experiencing disability for yourself. So I thought I would put Crip Camp in a little bit of historical context, and I wanted to mention a little bit about early efforts to include people with disabilities in the mainstream societies, our communities, and in the mid 1800s, reformers and activists, social activists like Dorothea Dix, started advocating for better services for people with disabilities, many of whom lived in institutions and asylums their entire lives. And as a result of these efforts, there were attempts made to improve institutions. And those efforts included creating residential schools and training programs for people with disabilities. In the 30s and 40s, the parents started to organize. Those parents did not want their children institutionalized or excluded from public schools. And they were deeply concerned about the lack of opportunities and lack of community resources and lack of an inclusive education. And that, continued in the 60s. And at that time, individuals with disabilities were primarily found in institutional settings. And some of them, as the dean, indicated, and Professor Francis expanded on, were, just horrible places like Willowbrook, an institution in upstate New York, where people with disabilities were abused, neglected in just a terrible, terrible way. In the 60s, the activism at Berkeley, that beginning with Ed Roberts, started to ask some important questions. And the independent living movement called attention to some very, very important issues, such as, what options does a person with a disability have? What could they do after graduation? What was their chance, to find employment or live independently? In the 70s, that activism continued with reform in educational rights. And there were 2 critical cases in the early 70s, Park versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and Mills versus Board of Education, that addressed the issue of education for children with disabilities. And at that time, the vast majority of children with disabilities were refused enrollment in public schools. There were millions of children who did not get to go to school with their peers, or they were served in institutional settings. And in both of those cases, the courts interpreted the due process clause of the 14th Amendment to give parents specific rights, and actually struck down local laws that excluded children with disabilities from schools. And that that led to the creation of IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Educational Act, passed in 1975, that required schools that accept federal funds to provide a free and appropriate public education for children with disabilities and ensure equal access to education for all children with all disabilities. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the Rehabilitation Act activism. This was beautifully depicted in the documentary, especially the occupation of the federal building in San Francisco, where people with disabilities actually, literally risk their lives. They were there without, their personal care attendants, sleeping on the floors, not having access to, just basic services, their assistive devices, but they were relentless in their pursuit for, equality and their fight for social justice and their desire to be integrated into mainstream society. So the Rehabilitation Act, signed in 1973, prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs conducted by federal agencies, programs receiving federal financial assistance, and in federal employment. 30 years ago, President Bush said, "Let the shameful wall of exclusion come down." And that moment marked, the birth of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the most significant civil rights legislation to be enacted by Congress. And the ADA makes it illegal to discriminate against anyone who has a disability in, many areas such as employment, public services, transportation, public accommodations, and telecommunications. In the 90s, the disability movement took, their activism a step further. And prior to 1991, the Medicaid program, the federal Medicaid program, paid for services only if a person lived in an institution. And really in the 90s, there was a movement, started by an activist, Katie Beckett, who desired to have her child and many other children with disabilities served in the community with Medicaid dollars, and a lot of change has happened since the 1990s. Basically, Katie Beckett was the first beneficiary of the new program, of the Medicaid waiver program that allows people with disabilities to be served in the community. She grew up, graduated from college, wrote a novel, and she was an amazing disability advocate. In 1999, the Supreme Court and the Olmstead decision, this majority opinion was written by Justice Ginsburg, held that unjustified segregation of individuals with disabilities is a form of discrimination prohibited by Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So basically, Olmstead creates an affirmative obligation for states to demonstrate a commitment to deinstitutionalization. And, some states have done better than others, but that basically opened the door for the deinstitutionalization activity that we see right now in the country, and recognized that segregation was unnecessary. Segregation of people with disabilities was unlawful. Basically, the home and community-based settings rule of 1214 is, I would say, the most recent attempt to promote deinstitutionalization of people with disabilities. And it allows people with disabilities who are waiting for services to receive, once they're eligible for those services, to receive services that are truly community-based. And, my agency has been working actively on the implementation of the HCBS settings rule. We've made some progress, but there's a lot more to be done. I wanted to just spend the last 3 minutes talking about some, truly important challenges and issues, that people with disabilities are still facing, 30 or 40 years after Crip Camp, or more than that at this point. And one of them is, segregation. People with disabilities, live in institutional settings still, even though progress has been made around the country to ensure that they have an option to live in the community. And there's, sort of an urban legend that people with disabilities are safe in these institutional settings, and they're, a great safe place for people with disabilities to be in. In reality, segregation of people with disabilities is not only morally wrong, but it is dangerous in many instances. If you needed, an evidence of that, the most recent COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated that people with disabilities institutionalized, especially those in nursing homes, have been negatively impacted, disproportionately impacted by this pandemic. Another important issue is self-determination. People with disabilities are often subjected to limitations on personal freedom. And we believe that people with disabilities should have an opportunity to make their own decision and assume the dignity of risk. Another important issue facing people with disabilities today is employment discrimination. And many people with disabilities are underemployed, unemployed, or stuck in dead-end jobs that pay less than minimum wage, which is still legal for people with disabilities to make less than minimum wage. And especially in October, when we celebrate 75 years since the proclamation of the National Disability Employment Awareness Month, we find a lot of people with disabilities who are still facing challenges in finding and maintaining employment. Those are just my few thoughts about the issues that we're still experiencing as a community many decades after Crip Camp. And I just wanted to end with a wonderful quote by a self-advocate. She said, "We want the community to see us as friends, coworkers, and neighbors instead of clients or patients, and to get rid of all those labels that hurt people." Thank you. And with that, I would like to turn the time over to Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Adina. I'm very excited to be here today to talk about this exciting film. And I want to thank Dean Kronk Warner for the invitation. My name is Angela Smith. I am faculty at the University of Utah in English and Gender Studies, and I'm also the Director of Disability Studies at the university. Disability Studies is an interdisciplinary field that grew out of the kind of activism that we see in Crip Camp. And it's focused on teaching the history and the present of discrimination and oppression against people with disabilities, but it also focuses on centering the knowledge and perspectives of disabled people. And I'm going to go back and forth in my terminology between people with disabilities and disabled people, since people identify differently. Many activists do prefer disabled people. And so I'm going to honor both of those preferences in my language today. I want to briefly describe the screen that you're seeing. So I have a PowerPoint showing with the title Crip Camp. And I have a very fuzzy still taken from the film that I just love and wanted to share. It's of 4 campers at Gen Ed, diverse campers, dressed in the clothes of the period. They are holding each other close, arms around each other. They are smiling and singing. And I really wanted to convey that sense that others have talked about of the pleasures and joy that this film conveys. And then briefly, an image description of me. I am a white woman with brown hair. I'm wearing a blue and orange patterned shirt. And behind me is a little bit of greenery and some off-white walls and doors. Okay, so I really want to thank Leslie and Adina for their really thoughtful comments and context that they've provided. And I want to myself just move through a few brief topics that came to me when I thought about this film, what it means to me. We see at the beginning and throughout the film really that the focus is on legislative change, and both of our speakers have addressed that topic. I'm an English professor, and so I'm interested in the narrative arc of the film. And it's very much about that kind of hoping for and working for progress towards first, the proper recognition of Section 504 and the regulations being put in place for that. And second, the movement towards the ADA with that triumphant climb up the Capitol steps by the activists that brings about that legislative change. And it's clear that in the US, legislative change is a key way to make an under-recognized group visible and to extend to them rights that have been denied to them. But as we've seen, as others have said, there's also a way in which once this change happens, it doesn't always mean it's enforced, funded, supported, or widely enacted. The burden remains often on disabled people to litigate, to bring suit when businesses, for instance, are not following the mandates of the ADA, or when schools are not following the requirements of access and education. And we see to a continuing denial of rights to some groups, as Adina spoke about, including in issues of reproductive autonomy and the right to vote, the right to self-determine. These things are still out of reach for a lot of people with disabilities. And I really love the moment in the film. It's sad, but very striking when Judy Heumann is at some event and she's like, I just can't be grateful for another accessible bathroom. And so there's a sense that still we're asking and pleading for people to give us this, and then we're expected to be grateful. And it's clear that we haven't reached a point of equality yet. So, my next heading here is beyond legislative change. And as the legal expert on the panel, I wanted to talk about the other things that come through in this film that are not just about legislative change. Today's disability activists want to broaden our understanding of disability and address, as Denise Jacobson says towards the end of the film, the need to change attitudes as well as laws. And to really transform the ways in which our society and culture think about and approach disability. A huge percentage of our population, as Adina said, can be categorized as disabled. And so it's integral to our human experience, and it's something we should reach out towards, understand, and embrace rather than pushing away from ourselves. Today's activists take up that slogan that Leslie mentioned, nothing about us without us. And I heard Jim Lebrecht in a panel just the other day say, what we're saying now is nothing without us. So whether or not it seems explicitly about disability, we want to be involved, right? We have a right to have input into how our society makes legal change, how our society conceives of education, how our society designs products, whatever it might be. Disabled people should be at the table and should be integral to decision making. And so I think that signals a shift in disability activism in the present day, where the goals are much bigger and broader and are much more about a widespread understanding and acceptance of disability. I wanted to note the existence of the disability justice movement, and this is one of the ways in which disability activism has developed. And I've said, if you go to the Sins Invalid site, and they're a performing arts company in San Francisco, and see what is disability justice, you get a good overview of the principles of this movement. which was created, in the last decade or so by a group of activists and artists in Oakland, most of whom identify not just as disabled, but also as queer or as people of color. And one of the things they've sought to do is point out that the disability rights movement of the 70s has benefited some people more than it has others. And it has tended to foreground white people with certain kinds of physical disabilities. And it has tended to decenter, for instance, people of color with disabilities. We see in the documentary some of those individuals involved in the 504 sit-in who are people of color. We hear quite a bit from Dennis Billups, for instance. But there were a number of others who are, seen very briefly and are not kind of at the forefront. And that is emblematic, I think, of the ways that people tend to think of disability as something affecting white people. And they don't think of it as intersectional with issues of race, immigration, issues around queer, trans, and gender nonconforming identity, and so on, indigeneity as well. There was an incident last year where a leader of ADAPT, one of the organizations for disability rights, who's now kind of left the organization somewhat, was on video complaining about how nonprofits and nonprofits and activists in the US cared more about undocumented immigrants in detention centers than they did about disabled Americans. And so it's that kind of prioritizing and hierarchy that today's disability justice organizers really want to challenge. They want to see disability as interrelated with other aspects of oppression, and to really center the perspectives of disabled people of color, queer people, immigrants, and so on. There is also a hierarchy of disability, and Denise Jacobson in the documentary talks about the hierarchy of physical disability that was present to her, where people who'd had polio were kind of on top, and the people with cerebral palsy were at the bottom. And as well, today's disability activist movement has tried to address other kinds of disability hierarchies, including sometimes the overlooking of people with non-apparent disabilities or invisible disabilities, people with mental disabilities, mental illness, chronic illness. And so there's a way in which that category of what disability includes is being broadened, and people are seeking to make inclusion happen in disability-specific places too. I think also there's a way in which the overcoming narrative is a little bit present in the movie, and we do celebrate like the little girl, Jennifer Keelan, who's climbing the Capitol steps. She's so defiant and so wonderful. But there's a way in which that kind of very visible activism tends to get center stage in those individuals seen as heroes. But those who maybe can't partake in that kind of visible activism are sidelined or not seen as valid or heroic in the same way. Jennifer Keelan, her story is not one of just overcoming as an adult with disabilities. She has been homeless at periods with her mother, who is her caregiver. And so structurally, our system continues to fail someone like her. Even though she had this moment of heroism and celebration, people tend to then marginalize disabled activists again. I wanted to note too, this where I have disability collectives, and this is addressing to the contemporary situation with COVID. We've seen the rise of mutual aid networks in this COVID time when people are sometimes homebound or reluctant to go out and need help with services, with delivery of food and so on. Mutual aid networks are something that disabled people and people with illness have been engaged in for a very long time. The system often fails them. Disabled people tend to live in poverty, a large number of them disproportionate to the larger population. And so disability activists like Leah Lakshmi have written about care webs. Mia Mingus has written about pods, which are collectives of people that you group together who can be there for you and help you out. And in turn, you can help them when you are able. And I think it's amazing to see how in this time of COVID, this knowledge and praxis by disabled people is becoming something that others turn to and learn from in a mode of collective access and collective liberation. Which brings us back to Camp Gen Ed and just those discussions at camp about what are we going to eat and who's going to prepare it, and we need to achieve consensus. It's this messy process that's very inclusive and that opens up to all kinds of different needs. Everyone is equally valid. Everyone gets a voice. So I think it's apt to finish on a note of celebrating the pleasure and joy that comes through in this documentary. I'm thinking of the moments where the camp group are talking to each other and enjoying each other's stories, the joy they have over the crab outbreak, how this brings them all together in a spirit of overcoming adversity. The description by Anne Freeman of the Halloween party where all these disabled people are in outrageous costumes. Steve in the documentary doing his drag performance. There's so many moments that are just beautiful and celebratory. And I think we sometimes only see disabled people in society in terms of sadness or anger or these kind of pitying discourses. And everyone in this documentary just blows that out of the water. They're just in your face, funny, smart people. And so it's that kind of humanity that really compels me in this movie. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand back to Dean Kronk Warner.
Wow, thank you all for just tremendous presentations and contributions. I really appreciated it, and just hearing you talk about the movie makes me appreciate the movie that much more. So with that, I am going to open it up to our audience. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please you'll see at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A button. So please feel free to enter your questions that you might have or comments into the Q&A, and I will moderate those. And while we wait for our audience members to type any questions or comments that they may have, my question that I'd be interested in hearing from you is, oftentimes in these discussions, we have audience members who say, I'm really interested in getting involved. What can I do to help the movement, to be a better supporter, a better ally? Do you have any suggestions for people who are interested in getting more involved or in being a good ally?
So, if members of the audience are lawyers, one of the things that they can do is volunteer through the signature program of the Office of State Courts. So one of the things that I do, and I've been able to do it statewide because the courts right now are doing most things virtually, is I represent people who are the subject of guardianship pro bono through the signature program. Under Utah state law, you've got a right to an attorney if someone is seeking guardianship. Guardianship, and Utah also prefers limited guardianship rather than plenary. So lawyers can volunteer. The Office of State Courts is always in need of volunteers. Another thing that some of you might be interested in is the Office of State Courts has what's called a visitor program. So if there is a guardianship petition, one of the things that is really important for the courts to have is objective information about the person's situation, well-being, and the people who are seeking guardianship. The court visitor prepares that kind of report for the courts. And a lot of the court visitors, it's all volunteer again, are people like retired social workers, retired attorneys, people with skills in the area of disability and disability rights. so that's something I think you can do. That's maybe more aimed at professional roles rather than advocacy. Something else I'd like to just underline is the importance of the recognition that historically a lot of disability rights has been driven by people with physical disabilities who were able to self-advocate. And so the more we can help and work with, not on people with all forms of disability to encourage self-advocacy, which we can all do in our daily lives.
If I may add to just, a couple of thoughts. Again, if you're looking for a way to get involved, please don't hesitate to give me a call. Our center receives about 4,000 requests for assistance every year. We are unable to meet that need. We always have opportunities for collaboration with, the private bar. We welcome, ideas, thoughts, and we also have a legislative advocacy team that works hard to advance the rights of people with disabilities. So please, give us a call if you'd like to know more about the issues that we're currently working on. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add, I would again recommend people go check out organizations like Sins Invalid. Locally, we have the Disabled Rights Action Committee, which is led and driven by disabled people and do a lot of really good political advocacy work. So supporting them and finding out what they need. A plug for Arts Access in Salt Lake City, which is an arts organization that centers the work of disabled artists. And they have really cool shows when COVID is not in effect. And then I would say have people think about their own events, their own practices in their workplace, and think about access as broadly as possible and be proactive about providing captions, about making available ASL interpreters if people want to reach out and ask for that, about, when we're in physical spaces, again, thinking about physical access, just there's always something we can be doing to make our spaces more inclusive.
Those are some great points. I have to say I've learned a lot just from our panelists, and I love how you used your PowerPoints to do the captioning. So just watching you in your presentations, I've personally learned a lot today. So we've got a question. Even though we have come so far with the ADA, what are still the biggest challenges facing people with disabilities? So some of you mentioned legislative work. Where do you think there's still legislative work to be done?
Funding.
I second that.
So just look at the lack of funding for home and community-based services. If you look at, so here's a statistic that might just shock people. Before COVID, only about half of people with Down syndrome were employed, and only 3% were employed full-time. Now, they were employed typically in the kinds of jobs that you can't telework for. So jobs like supermarket baggers or custodial, often working in teamwork settings or with job coaches where now accommodation is more difficult. So, I guess what that leads me to say is, I think there's a lot to be done about rethinking how we're going to understand work in the post-COVID era as well. So I guess the two things I would think about are money and rethinking some of the basic features of how we live our lives.
I could not agree more with Professor Francis. We have severely underfunded systems, and it's not just home and community-based services. Let's talk for a minute about our education system. If everything starts, at an early age. So if we invest in our children with disabilities at an early age, chances are that they will find them in the community, being gainfully employed, fully integrated, living rich and full lives, and not in an institutional setting, sometimes in the correctional system. So all these systems that serve people with disabilities are severely underfunded.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And unfortunately, I think it takes a radical rethinking of how we approach disability. People still see funding disability-related issues as kind of special interests, as kind of this little group that needs a lot of help and our charitable donations. And I think that's a really harmful way to think about it that leads to underfunding. When we should be thinking about how to make our society the strongest it can be, and inclusion of all the diverse perspectives and ways of being that disability brings to the society helps strengthen that society. We value biodiversity, kind of in ecological contexts. And I think in the same way, we need to value diversity of human beings and understand that our societies are going to be a better place if folks with disabilities are integrated, are included, are enabled to work and bring their knowledge to the table. So I think we have to, unfortunately, it's going to take a major rethinking. And capitalism is a system that tends to rank bodies and minds in terms of the kind of productivity they can bring to pre-existing ideas of what is valuable. And so rethinking that is a major challenge so that we can redistribute resources in the ways that everyone is talking about.
So there's a law professor at the University of Michigan who's also a disability rights advocate, Sam Bagenstos. He wrote a book called Law and the Contradictions of the Disability Rights Movement a few years ago, which looks at how there, in a lot of thinking about disability, there has been this tension between the sort of welfarist, pity, need help way of constructing people with disabilities and the independence, full legal personhood way of understanding people with disabilities. And I think it's really important to move away from the frame of pity, help, welfare, special, towards a frame of inclusion. And if people take away that from Crip Camp, I'll be thrilled.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end on. I have to say, listening to Dr. Smith talk about just all of the amazing diversity and additions that somebody with a disability could bring to the workplace. I was just thinking of if somebody has the capacity to overcome all these obstacles that we've talked about and wants to have a job, imagine what they would bring to the workplace in terms of capacity and diversity of thought. It just actually kind of excites me as a potential employer. So I have to say thank you so much to our panelists. This has just been a phenomenal conversation. I know I have learned a lot. I acknowledge that this is a blind spot for me, so I very much appreciate our panelists taking the time to educate us and to let us know how we can be good allies and how we can help. And so thank you so much for tuning in. Next month, we'll be discussing the Roundhouse, which discusses sexual assaults in Indian country and criminal jurisdiction in Indian country, as November is Native American Heritage Month. So we hope you will join us for a discussion of the Roundhouse. It is fiction, but I think it's poignant fiction. So I look forward to that conversation. In the meantime, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.